So normally I have to clap my hands or something. I'm kind of impressed. So it's my great pleasure tonight to welcome everyone to the university. I know many of our colleagues already know this is a tradition among the university, but also to open up our doors to our stakeholders, our friends, our family, members of the public who are interested. And welcome our new professors. And Suzanne has been a professor now for almost 2 years, so perhaps less than new, but to invite them to an inaugural lecture where we both celebrate the work that has contributed, in this case, to Suzanne's academic and ultimate joining the professoriate, and also in a way which acknowledges many of our supporters and increases the accessibility of our support. Suzanne has been with the Department of Civil Engineering for over 19 years, and in that process has really forged a unique role in something which, as ultimately somebody who's responsible for a large and growing faculty, I'm very, very thankful for disaster recovery and resilience. In that process, she's built links and collaborations with government, large industry stakeholders. Her work has taken both within New Zealand and overseas, and most noticeably recently in the Christchurch earthquake, where she's played a prominent role in looking at how the rebuild of Christchurch can be both optimised, improved, and addressed in the future. I asked Suzanne at the beginning if she had any really funny stories to tell me about her time, and she refused. There's always a little bit dangerous to not kind of taking control of the situation. But the only really funny story I know about Suzanne was when she was overseas, working in the South Pacific. We were sitting around a campfire with some of the local tribes and being asked to judge their family of pigs and piglets, and she pointed out one that was particularly cute, and then found that later on it was served to her on a spit. So, being a vegetarian, she was utterly conflicted in that process. So I'm sure nothing else will come to us today, particularly given the disaster recovery. We look forward to your lecture.
Thank you.
And welcome us to this today.
Thank you. So thanks really for coming tonight, and there's lots of familiar faces and some faces I don't know. Really pleased that everyone came along to my lecture. Disaster recovery is a field that I'm really quite excited about in terms of how we can improve the recovery environment for communities. So what I'm going to do today is just take you through one of the disasters that I've been very much involved in over time. February 2009, big bushfires in Australia. And 173 people lost their lives. Over 400 people were injured. 1,500 structures were destroyed. 2,000 homes were destroyed. 1 million animals killed, which I thought was a really interesting and sad statistic. 1 million acres were burnt, and an estimated loss of 942 million Australian dollars. We think of this disaster as a small disaster, but when you work with the communities and you spend a lot of time there, you realise no disaster is a small disaster when there's this kind of loss of life, loss of livelihoods, loss of homes, loss of businesses. We've been really lucky in our team. We've spent quite a lot of time in this area. Every year we've been going to look at the recovery of this area. And we're going to just walk you through some of the things that we have seen and some of the impressions that we've had. Our first trip was 5 months after the bushfires, and this was what we saw. We saw a burnt out landscape. Every house was reduced to ash. We saw some optimism. This poster, this banner here says we will build again, or we will build our house again, if you can't read it from the back. But there was a lot of displacement. We didn't see many people there at the time, lots of displacement out of the area. No one could basically live here. And the issues that are facing Christchurch face this landscape. Land use planning issues. Should we build here again, or should we stay? Should we stay or go? Should we move somewhere else? How can we live here again? We've got no homes, we've got no businesses, we've got no livelihoods. Our plots of land there were basically, that looked like here, and you can see here, well, there's a fridge, there's various pieces that didn't get completely destroyed. But waste disposal and demolition was a massive activity going on around here. So each plot was being carefully disposed. So they were going through the ash to find any little thing that was of significance to the homeowners. So they were finding things like jewellery, rings, necklaces that had somehow survived the terrible fires, and so they were carefully trying to dispose of this, of the waste that they were finding. Lots of assessments being done. So a church had completely burnt down. Assessments on whether to move, where's the congregation move to, what should we do about that? Do we still have a congregation? Do we build our church back? What kinds of church should we build here? But the interesting thing is, and which is something that we see in most disasters, is a commitment to rebuild. The government quite often will come into a disaster zone very, very quickly, very early on, and make that commitment, we're going to rebuild. And that's usually before the land use planning, usually before the assessments have been done, because it gives the community hope that they will survive this terrible event. A lot of the community were moved to temporary accommodation, those that couldn't move elsewhere. A lot of the community, like Christchurch, moved outside of the zone. So they moved to Melbourne, they moved to other places. And we started to see insurance already start impacting on how the community would recover. So insurances in terms of obviously people who had no insurance and were completely underinsured, and that seems to be a recurring problem where insurances drive recovery, but also people who were taking their insurances and just moving out of the area and saying, I'm not going to come back, and so they would move to other locations. And so they were building accommodation, not quite sure who was going to move into this accommodation. Every year since then, we've gone back and looked at and resurveyed and re-talked to communities, we talked to businesses, we talked to the building advisors, and we've kind of talked and looked at this whole process of recovery. In 2010, we went back and had a look, and there's so much uncertainty amongst the population. So they were not sure whether they were going to rebuild. There were people living in the temporary accommodation, not sure, whether they had businesses. A lot of them were living on government grants, so they were trying to work out what they were going to do in the future. And the symbol of hope that the government put in was a couple of very big public buildings. And so public buildings and public statements become the focal point of recovery. And so you quite often see in a recovery environment schools, community buildings, and big public statement buildings that go in first. And it's a deliberate activity to say, we are going to build back here, we do want our communities to come back, and it's kind of a symbol of hope. So Marysville, which was terribly affected by the fires, had its first rebuilding advisory centre and community facility built after 18 months when we returned. But the landscape looks like that. I mean, the landscape basically was empty. You've got a few buildings at the back, but almost the whole town still looked very much like this. Symbols of hope was still around, so 2011 we went back again, and again we can now see no fast rebuilding is happening. We've got businesses thinking about coming back, so this was a knitwear, basically a souvenir shop, and it's demonstrating that it's going to come back. Lots of the issues about businesses rebuilding were around insurances and waiting for insurance payouts. The other issue was there was no community, so people were wondering, if I build my business and there's no one here, my business isn't viable. And so they were waiting for communities to return, but communities weren't returning because there were no businesses. And they were saying, well, I can't return because I've got no livelihood. And so something needs to happen, and we have been monitoring this environment and looking at what's likely to happen over time. So here you have a big excitement in 2011 was that the petrol station reopened, and it was inviting people to come to the area. So you had one petrol station, you had one bakery, and it was inviting across Melbourne people to come and visit us. Because the bushfires happened in 2011. By 2009, by 2011, there's been other disasters. People forget, they forget that this terrible thing had happened, and they don't visit and they don't go there. I think to some extent we can see some of those things being played out in Christchurch, where people might bypass Christchurch in order to go elsewhere. What the community needs is some activity and some energy. We saw a few buildings in 2011, saw some businesses returning, and you probably like this, there's a couple of kind of container businesses here. So Christchurch had a similar kind of approach, and the lolly shop was one of the significant shops in Marysville at the time, and was one of the first businesses that said, we're going to fight for our community, and we're going to return, and we're going to sell our fantastic lollies again. So every time we've gone back, we've always bought lollies from the lolly shop, like lots of lollies from the lolly shop. My poor kids' teeth, have to visit. And the church rebuilt because it felt that it needed to as a symbol of hope and a symbol of returning community. So our church rebuilt. Now the two things here, labour shortages and materials, both of these impacted quite significantly on the rebuild, and it's a common feature that I'll talk about over time, is that we always see problems with labour and the rebuild, and so our team's really quite interested in making sure that the construction industry is able to respond in disaster environments. The second thing that impacts is, after a disaster, materials get changed and codes get changed. Once you change the materials and you change the codes, it has quite a big impact on how you rebuild. So it slows down the recovery because you now need to work out how to use those new codes. You need to do the designs for those new codes. And we're seeing the same kind of thing happen in Christchurch with the various new building styles and building codes that have come in. In 2012, we went back again and we started to feel finally that there was some hope for the community that we were looking at. And 42 months after the bushfire, the sculpture garden, which had been totally destroyed, was now rebuilding. And the sculpture garden had been one of the central kind of tourist attractions for this community. So people would go to this community because of this amazing sculpture garden. And it's taken this long for the sculpture garden to come back and rebuild. So businesses were seeing some signs. The lolly shop had its whole shop was just about to open. So at the back you can see the building's gone in. And we started to see quite a few houses now being rebuilt. So we saw the new planning laws and the new codes were finally feeding through into new building systems, and we saw some house building. Still a lot of land sales, but what's interesting is how green the whole area is. I mean, this area regenerated so quickly in terms of how the beautiful nature around the place, but when you walked around, you still saw a lot of land sales happening. And you did notice that the code changes were impacting. In particular, they were impacting through insurances, so you couldn't build what you thought you could build. So you may have had a really lovely, beautiful big house, but because the codes had increased the cost, you now couldn't build the kind of house that you wanted to build. And I think time and time again in disasters, especially ones that are insurance-led, we see this impacting on costs and changes when we have code changes. The government decided in 2012 that things weren't quite going to plan. There was a whole side of this community on one of the sides of the streets that didn't have, that wasn't rebuilding at all. And in fact, the community were getting increasingly vocal in terms of trying to be heard within Victoria. And the government had introduced a stimulus package. And this stimulus package is very similar to our anchor projects in Christchurch. It is there to stimulate the environment. And there's a commitment from the government to use this big convention centre that they were putting in. So the stimulus package, was a stimulus project, which the government co-funded, was starting to be built. And we saw a lot more activity, houses rebuilding, and Country Touch, the tourist attraction, the tourist shop had rebuilt as well. So we're starting to see much more activity. Year later, there was some problems with the stimulus package in terms of delays and time, which is part of the course for construction. I mean, we expect to see delays, we expect to see time and cost problems, but especially in a complex environment like a disaster environment. And I think we're seeing that played out in the media at the moment for Christchurch. We're seeing anchor projects delayed, we're seeing cost overruns for big projects. And it's perfectly normal for that to happen, especially on big stimulus packages. And so we're starting to see, in 2014, the stimulus package is still moving, but there's been some time and delays there. But you'll see the streetscape here is looking like a normal streetscape now. With the other side of the road, people are returning, people are visiting, businesses are returning. It looks like a lovely Australian village. There's still land sales going on, but essentially we've got some new homes, lots of new homes. And new homes and gardens. Now, the interesting thing about this picture is Marysville would never have looked like this beforehand. Every house in Marysville would have been surrounded by bush, heavily kind of down pathways, heavily surrounded by bush. And now we have a lot of clearance. A lot of the buildings all the way around have a lot of clearance. And that is to try and make sure that they don't have the same event. So I just went back in 2015, and unfortunately I couldn't go to Marysville because we had new fires near to where this area is. They weren't actually right in the bushfire area, but we had to drive through a forest that was close by, so I decided that probably wasn't a good idea. University's insurance probably wouldn't pay out to my family, so I figured that I wouldn't chance going there. But the stimulus project has been completed, and so our next few years will really be looking at what does this do to an environment? What does this do to the neighbourhoods, the livelihoods? What does the stimulus package actually do? Because I think it resonates with Christchurch. What are the anchor projects going to do for Christchurch? How are they going to be implemented, and how are they going to be maintained and run? So that was a kind of walk through a disaster that I've been, and Alice and a couple of other staff members have been kind of very intimately involved in watching this over time. Our team is amazing and big, and so we go to lots of other places, and I don't always get to go to these places. In fact, there's a standing joke in our team that Suzanne only goes to the easy disasters and everyone else has to go to the hard ones, so there's probably a little bit of truth in that. So Sri Lanka, we've had a student working in Sri Lanka for many years, a PhD student who's now become a postdoc, Sandika, and she has been looking at the recovery and reconstruction of Sri Lanka after the bushfires. So there's been memorials, and some of the houses have been rebuilt. Interesting similarities with a lot of the way we might think about disaster recovery, and that's around the relocation of people away from what's seen as a vulnerable, less resilient area to a more resilient place. And so these are buildings on higher ground away from the traditional livelihoods that these people would have been living in, which is on the beach, using the beach to live and work. Alice has spent quite a bit of time looking at the Sichuan earthquake, China after the Sichuan earthquake, and we're just very lucky in our team. We've got an international team of people, and so you can see the devastation, very similar to Nepal, the devastation we see from that. Alice didn't know I had this photo, so here's Alice in the photo, looking at some recovery aspects of relocation and looking at the community. What are they going to do in terms of rebuilding their homes and livelihoods? And this is the kind of place that they were living in. So this is kind of temporary accommodation for the people after the Sichuan earthquake. I think you can compare that to the Australian one, which was actually quite a lot more luxurious than the tents that people in China had to live in. In 2009, our team has spent some time in Samoa. In fact, we've been back 3 times now. We went along to this to look at recovery and relocation. We're particularly interested in how the communities are rebuilding in Samoa. And again, we see this complete devastation within an area and destroyed buildings. And there's our team, and again, you see the kind of temporary accommodation that people are forced to live in. And as I say, we've been back 3 times, our team, and each time we've been working with Samoan students to help them in terms of rebuilding their communities. So we've had students from the University of Auckland who are Samoan going back to their communities and trying to help and figure out, as engineers, what do they need and how will they rebuild and what kinds of processes could they put into to rebuild quicker. And just to show, I don't just go to the easy disasters. That is me. I am trying to get through one of the coconuts in Samoa. Okay, so this year I went to Japan, and these are photos taken this year in Japan. So we think of Japan, 2011, the earthquake and tsunami, we think of Japan as having kind of massively rebuilt and it's all very fast and very quick, but that's what I saw in March. Again, very similar to the bushfires in Australia, memorials, and if you look at the activity going on around the back, you see a whole load of activity, rebuilding, reconditioning the land. At this stage they were going to raise the land, so this is all the building activity going on there. Land sales, I'm sure they're down the front, but this is essentially looking at the landscapes very, very similar to the bushfires. And some of the destroyed structures. This was a school that survived, but also lots of children managed to survive because of this school, because it was high enough to protect the children who went to the top floor. That's what it would have looked like. That was a village town, not so far away from the region that we were looking at. And then our team, under the great guidance of Regan, have been looking at Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu. So they've been to look at some of the recovery and reconstruction processes that are going to be used in Vanuatu. So there's a few photos of the team going and having a look at and surveying the landscape. And that's some of the destruction that was happening in Vanuatu. And Regan and Beru's amazing team working in Vanuatu. I think Regan looks very scared there. So we also have had teams or people working in New Orleans. We've had people we've currently got a PhD student working in Indonesia, in Banda Aceh, looking at the recovery and reconstruction there. We've had people in various places like Haiti. We've had teams in Haiti as well. So what does this all lead us to? So one of the things we think about is we can go and look at these disasters over time. What do we take from this? What's it leading us to? It's leading us here. I think for us in New Zealand, we're not immune to disasters, and Christchurch is obviously, a big example to us to look at this landscape and try and figure out how do we we deal with this? How do we stop this being so destructive? And how do we prevent the kinds of livelihood loss and devastation that we see? Our team have worked very much on recovery patterns, and we've come up with kind of a suite of patterns. And one of the reasons for doing this is to assure governments and assure organisations that things do get better over time, and there are patterns to recovery that we see, that we can visualise, we can understand, and we can map against the process of recovery. Christchurch at the moment, people are saying, when is this going to end? When is this going to be over? And we can, with our research over time, say, these are the things we think are going to happen. These are the kinds of things we think you ought to do. This is the advice that our research teams, with its vast knowledge, can help you and provide. The first stage we looked at, we think is what we see: the chaos that happens after an immediate disaster, and the what do we do effect is a big part of the initial stages of recovery. I love this photo, so thanks Regan for providing this. Because the next stage is really about we realise that this is not easy. It's bigger than we thought. So our next stage of disaster recovery is all about realising and understanding that our disaster is bigger than we thought. And I think almost all disasters go through that. They go through this realisation phase. They move into a mobilisation phase, which is we're getting on with it. And you see massive activity, and I think you can understand from Christchurch, the first year of the disaster in Christchurch, the first anniversary, you just had so much going on. I mean, it was like everyone was kind of, pushing in the right direction, and everyone was going, we're getting on with it, we're moving, we're mobilising. But Christchurch is really here now. And it's going to be here for a while. It's in a struggle phase, and we even see this term come up quite a lot in the media at the moment. It's really hard, and it's not going to plan. And this phase is so common within every disaster we've looked at. We're running out of energy, we're running out of money, we feel like we've done so much, and yet we've got so far to go. And the plans that we thought we had just don't work, and they're not working. So that struggle phase is a phase that we see. It's not going to plan. But the last phase is this phase, and you do get to this phase, and the disasters that we've looked at over time, and Marysville is really getting to this stage now, and the Victoria bushfire area. So this is how it is. There's no going back. It's very different from how it was. And we just call it a new normal. It's different, and every disaster that we have looked at over time gets to that point where this is how it is, and it's very different. But we can live here, we can work here, and it's not bad being here. But to complicate it a little bit, we kind of can think about this under 4 different types of headings. We can think about this in terms of the built environment, badly affected, over time recovers. The environmental aspects, so the land use, the rehabilitation of the land, it recovers at different rates, and over time it recovers in a different way. The social environment recovers very differently from the built and the environmental land use recovery. And the economic recovery operates differently. So our team now is really trying to understand what happens to different environments, what happens to these different groups, and if you change one of them, what is the consequence on the others? And we can, just to map our stages, we can look at chaos, realisation, some mobilisation where you see some high activity, some struggle where it starts to kind of slow down and not really going to plan, and a new normal up here where we may never get back to the economic environment we had before. The built environment may be very different, but we're looking at a completely different kind of landscape. And what we want to do is be able to say, okay, if you change the building process here, you speed up the building process, it has consequences for both the economic, the social and the environmental. We're trying to understand that in our team and really looking at a lot of our data. And what it's led us to think about is this whole concept of Build Back Better. And it's a term that is used in the disaster area quite significantly now. And what it's essentially saying is, how do we get an environment that will be better than the one that we had, which is safer, more secure, more resilient than the environment we had? So it's about how do we build back better. We've been doing quite a lot of studies on this. We've got 3 studies going underway at the moment looking at Build Back Better in Christchurch and also in different zones around the world. And we've come up with a framework within our team, which is a Build Back Better framework. And under this, you'll see that there's 3 pillars of Build Back Better: reducing risk, recovery in the community, and implementing effectively. So having structures in place to implement effectively. So if we were to look at disaster risk reduction, the kinds of things that we need to do are the sorts of things that we're really thinking about in Christchurch. Improving our structures so that they're resilient, making sure the land that we use, that we're building on, is from a multi-hazard perspective, is good, strong land, and making sure there's education and early warning systems in place. If we look at effective implementation, to give you an example here, we're thinking about strong governance structures to recover well, but also structures that are bold enough to take on resilience and betterment projects. Because there's no point in building back if you're going to build the same thing back that's going to have the same type of problems if it's hit by another disaster. Or if it's hit by a different disaster, it gets affected in a different way. We want a multi-hazard approach to our recovery environment, but we also want the strong governance to take that message and to say we're going to build back better. And so we need legislation and regulations that support that, and we need a regime of monitoring and evaluation that will support that as well. So I was lucky, as I said, to go to Japan this year, and I went as part of the New Zealand group, so I am there I am very serious, and I notice Leanne Dalziel is laughing, so maybe, I thought I had to kind of stand very straight and be serious, but this was a part of the New Zealand delegation. It wasn't all of the New Zealand delegation. The 3rd UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, 2015, amazing experience, 10,000 people turning up from all over the world, including over 100 people from what's the country? I've lost it anyway, so Zimbabwe, that's right. So I saw Mugabe from Zimbabwe walk straight past me with about 40 people with peaked caps, and it was just an incredibly scary experience, but he took 100 people there, and that was questioned, like, why are you taking 100 people to this conference? But the framework was what the conference was about. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction was to be ratified here. There'd been a lot of pre-processes, and this was a framework to guide risk reduction around the world over the next 15 years. We had, as a team, we had been contributing to the pre-Sendai Disaster Risk Reduction Framework. We had been feeding in our research, and we wrote some papers into this framework. But what was really exciting for us, and is really exciting for our team, is Priority 4. It's enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. And it's right in the centre of the stuff that our team does. And so we were super excited to see that in the next 15 years, we're going to be working under a framework that clearly identifies our field of research as internationally significant. So it brings me on to some of the things that I've also been doing with our team. In order to build back better, you need a really good construction industry. And I think we have a really good construction industry in New Zealand. I've been working with people in the construction industry now for over 20 years. I've met some great colleagues and friends. We've got brands people here today, and I've been working with John for many, many years, so I really appreciate you coming today, John. But the construction industry has been, for us, one of the central areas of research. We've been looking at, if you have a really good, strong construction industry, you can build back better, you can recover better. And so our premise starts from there. And why? It's just so obvious to us, and yet it gets so neglected. I mean, they know where to build. They know what gets, they can work out what gets built. They know how it gets built. It's so obvious to us how it gets built, who builds it, and what it gets built with. So in terms of recovery, they should be central to the recovery process. And I think what we've seen is the construction industry being brought in after a disaster, but they need to be in the early stages, they need to be in the pre-planning stages, they need to be right in the forefront of talking about resilience and talking about improving structures, improving materials. So the construction industry has a significant role to play. And Christchurch is a good example of the problems that we've had. So we've been tracking recovery and the construction industry role in Christchurch over time, and we've seen shortages of labour, materials and plant. We've seen delays in projects. We've seen problems with quality in terms of repairs, but also problems with quality in terms of quality materials. And also we've seen problems with quality in terms of quality people that have come to rebuild. We've seen massive business changes. The construction sector has gone through a huge change in its businesses, the business structures they use, the relationships they work under. We've seen some very big changes with businesses, and we've also seen big increases in costs. And the construction sector has a big role to play in all of these aspects. Our work has been feeding into our work on skills. Alice and I and Regan and Sandika have been feeding all our work into the Christchurch construction sector workforce plan. We've been looking at skills issues in Canterbury since the first series of earthquakes. We had, right at the beginning, we had identified that there were going to be problems with skills. And so we were trying to feed that information into different agencies and get it out to the construction companies and the workforce agencies in Christchurch to say, we think you need to really consider where the skills are coming from. We know there's going to be lots of problems with skills over time, because that's our previous research had clearly demonstrated that. We'd also been looking at when you have a major disaster, it changes the structure of an industry. So we started some work, we've been looking over time at the types of people that come into a recovery environment. One of the interesting things about this is Christchurch is not going to be the same culturally as it was before the earthquake. It's going to be very, very different. And the construction sector is one of those sectors that is pivotal to the change. So if we can have strategies around what do we do when people from different nationalities come into the industry, around training and encouraging and supporting them into the industry and the wider community, it means that we recover well. We recover well, we don't lose those skills, we don't lose those people once the recovery it starts to change and starts to go into a different level. So our recent piece of work is around resilience, and we looked at the construction businesses. We're really interested in trying to make sure our construction sector understands its responsibility and its role in a recovery environment. But in order to do that, it needs to be resilient. It needs to have a strong base in order to provide support during a major event. What we found in our recent study was that companies themselves are quite reactive. They don't tend to have plans to assist them with being resilient and building their resilience. Big companies have a moderate degree of resilience, and it's partly their size. They're able to kind of maneuver in terms of numbers of people and transfer people. The small companies are the companies that have particular problems with the resilience of those companies. And they're telling us they don't have any funding to develop resilient strategies. So they're very reactive because that's how they always have been. They don't think about pre-planning. They don't think about these kinds of events that could derail their companies. And one of the big things is around the cost of that. They also don't have the knowledge and experience to deal with and develop resilient strategies. So part of our research now is to work with small and medium-sized construction companies to help them develop knowledge and experience and expertise around resilient strategies. And finally, they don't have simple ways of achieving resilience in their companies. So we're trying to think about what are easy and simple ways that construction companies can use to build up their resilience over time. And why is this important for us? Because it's important because we live in a highly susceptible, vulnerable city. We have, floods, earthquakes, we're at tsunami risk. We have problems that affect our communities. And so we need to build now. We need to use our knowledge and build a resilient Auckland. So I'm lucky enough to be working on the National Science Challenges under the Resilience Challenge. And so for the next 5 years, maybe more, maybe 10, depends if I end up as head of department, which is a bit scary. So Resilient Auckland is a focus for our team. And we're starting up a whole series of projects. Actually, I think that's Martin's head just down the bottom thing. His head there. Okay. We're going to be looking at resilience across different cities. So both Christchurch and Wellington are quite ahead of Auckland in their thinking around resilience, especially Christchurch, because obviously it's rebuilding and it's thinking about resilience. And Wellington has been awarded one of the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities Awards, and so is also now heavily thinking about resilience. And now our council are now thinking about resilience and what do they do. So one of our first things is to develop the relationships between the cities to make sure that information is shared across cities to build that resilience. We're definitely going to be looking at businesses and how they can build their resilience. So we've got a stream of work which is going to be led by Alice under Resilient Auckland Businesses. First of all, looking at construction businesses as the corner stone of some of the resilience strategies that we want to use. Resilient Auckland infrastructure is a huge piece of work that is going across many different streams of funding at the moment, and we're lucky at the University of Auckland to be part of and have Ken in the audience, who's director of Quake Core. Quake Core is all primarily about resilient buildings and resilient infrastructure. So our Resilient Auckland project will feed off that and feed into that. And the resilient planning, if you don't have strong planning systems in place, you don't get resilient outcomes. So we're going to be looking at the planning processes to strengthen those so that we can incorporate into our land use, into our buildings, into our codes, ways of improving our building and our landscape before we have an event that affects us. And the other big component of that is working with communities to build their own resilience, to get them to understand what does resilience mean and how can those communities build their resilience. So that piece of work will be primarily led by Andreas, who's also here tonight. So just a few extra slides. I'm coming to near the end of the talk. One of the things that our team has been doing is working under a Centre for Disaster Resilience, Recovery and Reconstruction. Very important for us that we educate people about disasters and disaster management, and so we have within our faculty a new Masters of Disaster Management that feeds out right across the campus, and we've been really lucky to be allowed to kind of set that up and run that. We've just had our first cohort of students. We're also making sure our work is internationally recognised. We're running a 2016, the 6th International Conference on Building Resilience. Really exciting for our team to get our team right in the centre of what's going on internationally and bring international speakers to us. So here's some information about that. We'd obviously welcome people to come along and understand a bit more about this area. I guess I really want to say thank you to people. I mean, I can't do this work without the big funders of our research. So these are the big funders that fund our research and have done over the last 15 or 11 years. We've been really lucky that we've had funding over time and support from those agencies whenever we've been trying to take a different direction or understand something in a different way. Our team is absolutely awesome. This is the Regan's UN tent parked in the library, and these are all the students that helped us put the tent up. This is our annual writing retreat that our team goes on, and this is part of the wider construction management team. This is our first cohort of disaster management students. We are really lucky to have had a big international crowd of people who have been funded by our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And so what we teach in them and what we're learning from them is just enhancing our knowledge of disaster recovery and disaster resilience. And we've also been inviting international speakers. So this is Patrick Daly from Singapore. I was lucky enough this year to go to Singapore and spend some time with Patrick. Patrick visited us and presented some of his work. And he is going to be, for us, one of the pivotal people for our team over time. He's just very, very generous with his time. And finally, we have an amazing group of students who come every year around my house to celebrate the end of the year. So this is the PhD students from a recent group. So I'm just going to go and say thank you to some more people because they weren't in the photos. There's I'm the kind of person who I love working in teams and groups, and I've just been really lucky to work with all different teams. I think one of I was really surprised that Sarah and Caroline came because we've known each other for 12 years through the Women in Leadership programme. And if you're a woman academic at the University of Auckland, you need to go on the Women in Leadership programme because it is so amazing, and it's meant that we've had such support over time. And so, it's really lovely. They've come and supported me tonight. I didn't have photos of you, so I had to kind of give you a verbal thank you, okay? Because my team, who couldn't live without Regan and Alice? They are just phenomenal. So brilliant people to work with. And Sandika, our lovely postdoc, our gorgeous postdoc. Gary and Shosif are people I really respect and spend a lot of time with. And my other people in the construction management team, we've stolen Mehdi from mechanical, and Vicente and Kenneth are part of our construction management team. So I really appreciate working with you guys. It's really lovely. Our past PhD students have gone on to do some amazing things. So here's some of them. James, Temi, and Kelvin is here. So Kelvin, you didn't know I had that photo. And there's some of the previous PhD students, some of the current ones that are here. You'll see them, some of them are in the audience tonight and some of them are overseas. But unfortunately, if I've forgotten anyone, which I know I have, because there's some new people I didn't have photos for, then they're here. Nationally, we've got a few people I have to thank, and these are just three people I spend a lot of time with and also spend a lot of, I respect greatly. Dave Brunsden, who doesn't know Dave Brunsden in this field? He is everywhere and everyone's friend. And he is so generous with his time, isn't he, Alice? It's just phenomenal. And Eric and Dean are long-standing partners of ours. But finally, I wanted to thank Pierre. Amazing what you can find on the internet. So Pierre, I mean, thank you so much for all your support. I mean, you are the centre of our team, really. You're the person who makes it all happen for us. Coming to the end of the talk, one person in particular and a couple of other people are the amazing family. I couldn't do this job without Martin, everyone knows that. Everyone knows I also love tea, so there's me drinking a cup of tea. But Martin, thanks so much for all the nearly 30 years of being together, and the kids for having to put up. Poor kids have to put up with mum kind of always working or saying, oh, I'm off somewhere, sorry. So that's the end of the talk. Thank you very much.
To see Martin's photo after mine. Thank you, Suzanne, for a very interesting lecture. It was worth the wait. For the majority of people you've dealt with, the situations you've described are traumatic. But you and your team have vowed to make a difference to help them recover from these events. Moreover, the knowledge, experience you've gathered is being used by government so that we can prepare for other events that undoubtedly will happen in the future. You are making a significant difference. That difference, you are not making it alone. The leadership you have shown in your research, you've also shown in the construction management group. As HOD of the department, I've had a front seat seeing this, and really you've made a very positive contribution. Congratulations on becoming a professor. Well-deserved promotion. Saying that between a woman and a man, the man shall not have the last word. I now introduce Alice.
Thanks, Pierre, for giving me this opportunity to really present a surprise. On behalf of all the past and current PhD and master students, so I'm Alice Cheng Richards. I used to be Suzanne's PhD student. And it's such a privilege that I'm still standing beside her and at the same time working with her. So it's really been a privileged experience. So each of the previous and current students sent me a note. So I really tried so hard to summarize all these notes together into a poem. So I really want to read it to Suzanne. And so Suzanne, you have been there for each of us in our joys and also in our pains. You have never given up each of us, no matter how we perform and what hurdles we face. We won't be able to come so far without all your support and guidance. You influence us professionally to be a good academic. You also influence us to be a good person. That's what education and supervision are about. And we just want to let you know that you will always be remembered by us, not only as a disaster lady, but also you will be remembered by us as our best supervisor, a wonderful friend, and a great, kind, caring, and gracious lady from all of us. Thank you.